Whitewashed: My Assimilation in Australia as a Child of Chinese Immigrants. My assimilation was an invisible experience to me. It was an unconscious and automatic survival response for a young Chinese girl placed in a completely white Australian context. A response that involved the rejection of my Chinese background, culture, and identity, and the learning and adoption of a white Australian persona. Context. My parents are Chinese. My dad moved to Australia aged 16 in 1985, and my mum aged 26 in 1996. I was born and raised in Melbourne, Australia in 1997. The context of my assimilation is of a certain time and situation and is by no means universal. My experience felt like it was all on my own, with no guidance or support, role models or others with similar experiences to look to. First, the generational and cultural context of my parents meant that there was no awareness or consideration as to what placing a Chinese girl into a white Australian context would mean, or what support might be needed. I do not condemn my parents for this, it was simply an unknown unknown. I was the oldest child within my extended family and family friends. My sister, cousins, and family friends are all many years younger than me. Further, my parents never tried to assimilate into Australian society. They socialise only with other Chinese families, go to Chinese church, my dad is a member of a Chinese spearfishing club, and my mum has only ever worked in Chinese businesses in Australia. I couldn't watch and learn from my parents when it came to assimilation. There was no one I could look to as a role model to guide me. On top of that, I grew up in Mentone, a predominantly white suburb in Melbourne in the early 2000s. Up until year 8, I was always either the only or one of a couple of people of colour in a school of otherwise white Australian students. This meant I rarely saw anyone that looked like me at school. From the age of 3, assimilating into Australian society was a journey that I took on my own. Pretend. When I think of my assimilation, I have a strong memory of darting eyes. The feeling of constantly looking around at others, inconspicuously observing how others were doing things and copying their actions and behaviours. My assimilation involved always looking out and pretending that I too was like them, copying their behaviour whilst also hiding my differences. I assumed any differences I had were because of my Chinese background and were always accompanied by an automatic assumption that it was wrong and need to adapt the Australian way. This meant I never owned my differences, which made it difficult to be my own person. I was always pretending to know what others were talking about, pretending to be the same as everyone else, pretending I wasn't different in any way at all, except that I was in so many ways. I remember pretending to know slang or swear words I'd never heard of before, or being invited over for playdates and copying and pretending to know how to use a knife and fork. I remember watching someone in my class blow their nose oh so quietly and take a mental note that that was how I was supposed to blow my nose. I felt ashamed that I had blown my nose loudly previously, and then copying and blowing my nose quietly. I remember wearing my socks inside out one day and someone asking me, "Don't you wear fresh socks every day?" I felt ashamed and quickly pretended I did and made sure not to do that again. I remember writing an essay for school where I described the experience of washing the dishes. I wrote about the feeling of touching the food and the water, and my teacher asked, "Don't you wear gloves?" I felt so embarrassed and immediately assumed that it was a Chinese way of washing dishes, the wrong way. The other kids at school were taught by their Australian parents at home, whereas I learned through observing and copying in the schoolyard. I learned how to be Australian by observing and copying. Everyone else's differences were right and allowed. All my differences were wrong and to be hidden. Everything I did differently needed to be adapted. Observe and copy, observe and copy, pretend, pretend, pretend. Little Mimi, so much shame, pretending, fitting in. Such a fiery, free, loud, fun girl. With each observation, with each adapting act, she becomes smaller and smaller. Assuming her culture and anything she does differently is wrong, she doesn't feel like she can just be different. She has to adapt. She has to learn how to be Australian. She has to pretend to be Australian. My shame of being different still rears its head. I still have an automatic shame that comes with not knowing something or doing something differently, accompanied by an instinct to scramble and pretend I know. At work once, my colleague was telling me about her friend's kid who was really into K-pop dancing. I asked if the kid had performed for them. It's a really common thing to do in Chinese culture, parents making children perform for them. My colleague asked, why would we make her dance for everyone, with an innocently judgmental tone? My body immediately seized up with embarrassment. I'm still learning and practicing saying the words, I don't know what that is, or, oh, we do that differently because I'm Chinese. Reject. In year 9, I moved to a new school. It was a very academic school that required an exam to get in. With this came a majority of Asian students. By that point, I felt I had achieved assimilation, as I acted like and was included in social groups of white Australians. I identified as white on the inside and Asian on the outside. I even proudly called myself a banana. My internalized racism was deeply ingrained by this point. Arriving at a predominantly Asian school, I differentiated myself from the other Asian students. I othered them. I rejected them. I put distance between myself and them to show my white Australian friends that I was not like other Asians. I was actually white like them. I was explicit in my rejection. I often referred to Asians as if they were a different group to which I was not a part of, and was quietly proud when I was called whitewashed. My internalized racism continued through most of university, manifesting in more inconspicuous ways. Predominantly, this involved socializing almost exclusively with white Australians. I had an unconscious idea of social success in my head, which looked like being part of white Australian social groups, often cool private school groups. If I could make it in those groups, the most elite, then I had truly succeeded at assimilation. With the transition to adulthood came new things to learn and pretend. For example, pretending to small talk and banter in an Australian way, which is so different to how Australians interact and came so unnaturally to me and created so much social anxiety. With my darting eyes, I closely observed how others behaved in social settings and copied their behaviour. I learned how to ask questions and small talk, and the feeling of pretending to get jokes that I did not understand is still ever familiar. Realize. For a long time, I didn't think racism affected me, and I wasn't even aware of my assimilation. I started recognizing my assimilation in my final year of university via the Black Lives Matter movement in 2019. I was 22. I learned about overt and covert racism and how, although I hadn't experienced overt racism, that covert racism meant that I had to go to great lengths to adapt my whole person to be accepted by white Australians. I learned about the power imbalance between races and racism, and that fighting to make it in a white society as a person of colour entailed being the most excellent at everything to have a seat at the table, often next to white peers who are allowed to be much less impressive. At my first corporate job in 2020, I observed how Asians in a white workplace couldn't access the same levels of social comfort as their white peers in the company. For example, I discovered that there was still a group of Australians that were inaccessible to me, white Australian men, the real blokey kind. I remember realising I had never really talked to any in my life and therefore didn't actually know how to talk to them. I had worked retail jobs where I learned to talk to white Australian women, but had simply never been exposed to any white Australian men. I noticed my Asian peers had similar experiences and were not able to build relationships with them in the same way our white peers could. Unfortunately for us, the covert racism of our society required us to learn to speak like them in order to succeed in that environment. I still vividly remember a customer meeting where the men were bantering and I chimed in with a joke and was met with the deafening and mortifying sound of crickets. A friend once said that professional networking feels racist, and it truly feels that way to me. On a related note, I remember comparing photos of corporate graduate cohorts, mostly white, with graduate cohorts of doctors, mostly Asian. It may be the case that Asians mostly aim to be doctors for the high pay, but are alternative industries that require networking and socialising with white people really an option that is open to us in the same way as it is for our white peers? The picture of my experience assimilating in Australia continues to grow more vivid. I paint the following picture in an attempt to highlight the extent to which Australian and Chinese cultures and upbringings differ. For white Australians, think of their family, their upbringing. Through parents at home, through family barbecues and Sunday roasts with aunts and uncles, they learn how to speak English, Australian vocabulary, idioms, slang, Australian humour and sarcasm, how to joke, nickname, banter, small talk, Australian humility and social rules, norms and etiquette, Australian culture. These things are all modelled to them. Everything listed previously, we do differently in my Chinese family and community. I learned English from my parents' second language English and from the kids that I went to school with. In my family, we communicate directly and honestly. Politeness is considered irritating and bizarre rather than expected and respectful. It's not rude to comment on obvious things like money, weight, appearance, and intellect. We interrupt and talk over each other. We don't do small talk or ask each other how our days were. We don't respond with smiles or laughter to be polite. We aren't precious or indulgent. We don't do self-introspection or self-care. There is a strong sense of respect and responsibility to your family, parents, and elders. Expressions of love and gratitude are mostly expressed through gestures rather than words. We are wild and unfiltered with how we express ourselves and our emotions. When I took my parents to my Australian in-laws for dinner, my dad came away observing that they were so polite with each other, even between my partner and his mother, who are very close. He could feel that there were a lot of social rules, of which he found tiring. The way Australians and Asians socialise is so very different. Despite the extensive differences in cultures, I grew up dropping and hiding all the Chinese parts of me, and picking up and adapting to white Australian society as much as I possibly could. This is how I experienced covert racism in white Australia. You may hear the above and think, well, no one asked you to do that, you could have just been yourself. But that's not what it felt like. At a minimum, we are social beings who want to be included. I saw everyone around me act and talk in a certain way, and in that context, at the very least, I needed to act and talk in that way to be accepted and included. But the most powerful force was the unintentionally covert racism present within Australian society. When you overlay the power imbalance between the white race and other coloured races, there felt like an absolute need to adapt to the white Australian society around me, not just to fit in, but in order to have any chance at success. Sure, no one asked me to behave the way I did to assimilate, but no one showed me it was safe to not do it either. If anything, anytime I diverted from my adapted white self, I felt judged and made to feel different. I really acknowledge that white Australians have always been kind to me and treated me the same as anyone else, and for that I am grateful. However, herein also lies the problem. Treating me the same as anyone else came with a silent expectation that I act like everyone else. The silent expectation to adapt and banter and chit-chat like a white Australian. With that, my differences became invisible. I often felt there was little space or interest for the Chinese parts of me. Covert racism manifested as a silent but intense pressure to abandon my Chineseness and instead act like white Australians, to be whitewashed. How could things be different? When I think about what would have made me feel safe being myself, my true Chinese Australian self, I think that it was a curiosity and interest in my differences that was missing. I do not expect people to have known how my Chinese family and culture meant that I had to abandon my Chinese identity to assimilate to white Australian culture. But I do think if generally there was more curiosity and interest, if people actually wanted to hear and learn about my culture and family, then that would have made a safe space for me. I would have felt allowed to be different. Even in my interactions with some young progressive white Australians today, it is the invisibility of other cultures that I find difficult. My Chinese culture and family is such an enormous part of me, and yet I find that unless I bring it up myself, it never comes up. How could that be? It's hard to share parts of yourself when people don't seem to be interested. And I don't mean to say this harshly and condemn. Instead, I hope this message comes across as an eye-opening insight. To white people, I encourage you to openly and gently ask yourself and reflect on how you make space for the people of colour in your life. Or if you don't have many in your life, why might that be? It may be a confronting question to ask, and I do not condemn you if you find that your circles do not reflect how multicultural the Australian population is. It took me 20 years to start noticing. I implore you to be curious as to what non-white experiences look like and how you can create safe spaces that encourage people of colour to be their true selves, where they don't have to adapt to, sound and act like white Australians. Embrace and share. Today, I love my Chinese identity and culture. I embrace it and love to share it. I value my Asian friendships. I gravitate to friends that I feel completely comfortable being myself, where I can let all pretenses that I once adopted fall away. They see and love the parts of me that are Chinese, wild, unfiltered, and honest. Bit by bit, I feel slowly healed by friends that laugh and love to hear about my funny Chinese parents and family, and are curious and excited in my Chinese culture, food, and history. My recovery is still difficult and rocky though. Sometimes I try to show parts of my Chinese self to some, and they are sadly not so interested. I try to introduce Chinese foods to Christmas lunches, to share a book I made about my ancestry and family history, and they are met with polite indifference. It's glaringly obvious to me when I'm in an all-white setting, and in these moments I still feel socially anxious. All-white friendship groups and events, especially the cool kind, make me feel uncomfortable, and I don't feel like it's a safe space for me to be myself. I feel more pressure to be like everyone around me. Alternatively, when I'm around other people of colour, I truly feel allowed to be myself. There's a felt sense of ease, comfort, and safety. I feel like I'm allowed to be direct, sillier. I don't have to pretend, whereas talking to white people feels like stepping into another persona. Excitingly, I recently moved to Taiwan and am excited to connect and discover more about Asian culture, as well as the healing experience of being around people that look like me and who I don't feel like I have to pretend for. Conclusion. I often hear the Asian story depicted via an Asian child at school with food that smelled and looked different, who goes home and asks their parents to pack them sandwiches instead. Although it is a very powerful image that captures how even the smallest of differences between Asian and Australian culture can bring about shame and embarrassment, I have found my Asian immigrant assimilation experience to be so much more than that. My experience of assimilation in Australia has affected me to my core, including my psyche, personality, esteem, and person. It took me over 20 years to start seeing glimpses of what was an invisible experience, and still at 27, I am noticing and will continue to notice the incredible ways I've been impacted and shaped by this experience.